The spike of doom. Whenever climate alarmists want to shock us, they show us the history of Earth's temperature over thousands of years, and at the end there's always this terrifying line upwards, the spike of doom, or uptick of terror. This, they say, is an accurate picture of current and past temperatures. As we'll see, it's nothing of the kind. And it's designed to convince us that current temperatures are rising like crazy, abnormally high, and clearly unnatural, caused by you and your Nissan Versa and George Foreman gas barbecue. You see these ticks of doom all over the place, on the internet, on TV, in newspapers, in school books, in presentations to politicians. They're everywhere. It's an incredibly potent bit of climate propaganda, because for all those unfamiliar with the science of historical climate reconstruction, and let's face it, that's more or less everyone, there is no obvious reason to question or doubt it, and it looks extremely alarming. Well, I'm here today to explain why every last one of these spikes of doom is total, solid gold, 100% garbage, an offence against science with no more connection to actual scientific data and observations than flying dragons, Donald Duck and the Tooth Fairy. We'll see that all of these pricks of Armageddon originated with one particular bit of gibberish, the famous, or should I say infamous, graph known as the hockey stick. The hockey stick was long ago shown to be drivelling nonsense, but as the hockey stick and each successive spike is exposed as codswallop, like Venus from the foam, another crops up to take its place. There have now been 4 spikes of doom purporting to be accurate depictions of historical temperature, of which all the spikes we see are based. So here is the short, hopefully entertaining story of the 4 horseshit spikes of the apocalypse, or, if you prefer, 4 spikes that conned the world. I'm Martin Durkin, and this is Guerrilla Science. The scary graphs that are supposed to prove that current temperatures are the warmest in 10,000 years. Are they honest science, or are they cynical rewrites of previously accepted climate history achieved by cherry-picking, manipulating and editing data, grafting together conflicting and equally unreliable data from different sources, altering data by processing it with dodgy algorithms, misrepresenting made-up model predictions as real data, the suppression of inconvenient findings, and the censorship of criticism? I'll let you judge for yourself. Let's look at the daddy of them all, the hockey stick. Let me set the scene. Back in 1990, when the UN's IPCC was just 2 years old, they published a couple of graphs depicting historic temperature change. They were based on the work of Hubert Lamb, considered the greatest climate scientist of his time, and even the father of modern climate science. Lamb wrote huge books about climate, like this and this. They were the Bibles of climate science in their day. Lamb, by the way, remained till his death in 1997 a climate skeptic, unconvinced that humans were having any measurable or significant effect on the Earth's climate. His graphs represent simplified versions of the consensus view of the time of Earth's climate history, the result of many decades of painstaking archaeological and geological research. This one shows temperature over the past 1,000 years, ending roughly in 1950. See that big bump in the past? That's the medieval warm period, much warmer than the mid-20th century. Then follows the so-called Little Ice Age, according to many studies the coldest it's been for 10,000 years. And then our slow recovery from this, the current mild warming that started 300 or 400 years ago. The IPCC also published this, Lamb's temperature reconstruction for the past 10,000 years, the period geologists call the Holocene. Here's the very warm Holocene maximum or optimum, much warmer than recent times, lasting a few thousand years, then the very cold Little Ice Age, with a small uptick to the early 20th century. The trouble with these graphs, if you're a climate alarmist, is that they're not very scary, because the past was significantly warmer than the present. And indeed, the IPCC was even forced to say of the latest warming trend that clearly began a few centuries ago, it is not possible at this time to attribute all or even a large part of global warming to the greenhouse effect. Not much need for the IPCC then. Luckily, a PhD student came to the rescue with this graph. This is the beginnings of the famous hockey stick. It was originally produced by taking tree ring measurements and then selecting, arranging and processing them in a particular way. We'll come back to that. And it purported to show temperature change in the Northern Hemisphere over the last 600 years. It started in 1400. If we look on Lamb's graph, that's after the medieval warm period had finished. and before the Little Ice Age. But on the new graph, the famous Little Ice Age had been flattened out until about 1900, when suddenly there came a terrific spike up to about the 1950s. After the 1950s, temperatures seemed to wobble about a bit, with no clear trend up or down. The IPCC were delighted with this spike, limited though it was, and gave the young researcher who produced it the role of lead author on a key chapter in their next 2001 report. And it was this report that published the famous hockey stick. The 600-year graph was back-timed to 1,000 years. Now he managed to flatten out the medieval warm period too. What's more, the annoying tree ring data after 1950, which didn't show any clear warming, was chopped off, and in its place he had grafted on this additional red spike, which he had taken from a different source, the official adjusted thermometer record, an important graph to which we'll return. It's a different colour because it's not part of his actual study. However, because his study is in blue and this add-on is red, some people made the mistake of thinking it's part of the same line, and the red indicates boiling heat. We can only wonder if this misleading impression was accidental. The resulting hockey stick spike looked super dangerous and out of the ordinary, and it became an overnight sensation. It grabbed newspaper headlines. New evidence finds this is the warmest century in 600 years. Millennium ending with record heat. It hasn't been this sizzling in centuries. The main author of the graph, Michael, became a celebrity, quoted in the papers and appearing on TV.
We are speaking to the man who might be the world's most famous climate scientist.
Dangerous climate change has arrived. So the question now is, how bad are we willing to let it get?
It cannot be overstated how this spike changed everything. The IPCC went crazy promoting it. It became a centerpiece of Al Gore's Oscar-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth.
But compared to what's going on now, there's just no comparison.
The Canadian government loved it so much, they sent it on a leaflet to every home in Canada. It was so impressive and alarming, it even helped to seal the Kyoto Protocol, the first global climate agreement.
Decided.
The hockey stick became the emblem of global warming, and for the thousands of bureaucrats at the IPCC, it effectively secured continued government funding for years to come. Unfortunately for Michael and the IPCC, a couple of scientists in Canada decided to do a little digging into the data used to create the graph and the methods used to handle the data. Steve McIntyre, a mining engineer and statistics whiz kid, started picking holes, and he was joined by Ross McKittrick, a professor at Guelph University. They looked up the trees used to construct the hockey stick. Remember, the study is based mainly on the measurement of tree rings. He found that of the 112 raw data sets that went into the study, only 13 were in the shape of a hockey stick. For some reason, trees which showed an increase towards the end were given 390 times the weight of trees which showed none. McIntyre and McKittrick then looked at the algorithm, which apparently had been used to process the data. To see how it performed, they decided to shove in random data. Anything. Currency fluctuations, football results, just random noise. After doing this 10,000 times, they found that the algorithm turned random data into hockey stick-shaped graphs 99% of the time. What's worse for the climate alarmists, the blue spike, which is the only spike created by the data, was in the wrong place. The study was only able to produce a spike from 1900 to the 1950s. That doesn't make sense because it doesn't match changes in atmospheric CO2. Here's a graph from NOAA depicting changes in atmospheric CO2. Before 1950, CO2 rises and falls with no clear trend. It's only after 1950 that there's any distinct rise. And it's only after 1950 the IPCC has repeatedly stated that we should expect to see any signal of man-made global warming. To create or extend the spike, the authors were forced to use this red bit at the end. Let's turn to that now. Grafting together two different graphs from two different datasets produced by two different methods is considered very bad practice in science at the best of times. But it's even worse when one, or in this case both, of the graphs are subject to considerable scientific controversy. The red line added to the hockey stick purports to be an instrumental temperature record. In fact, it's an agglomeration of thermometer readings from largely urban and suburban areas around the world, which have been further altered or adjusted by climate agencies. Now, the problem is, the growth of towns and cities over the past century has led to a rise in recorded temperatures in those areas which has nothing to do with climate. Here, for example, is the recorded rise in temperature in urban Tokyo, where over the past 120 years the population has grown from 2 million to 37 million. And here is the temperature record in nearby rural Hakujijima Island, which has barely changed in more than a century. The temperature change in urban Tokyo has nothing to do with climate change. It's due to a massive increase in population and everything that goes with it. More cars, trains, buildings, and so on. When we look at unadjusted thermometer readings and at readings from rural weather stations only, a different picture emerges. Here is the actual thermometer temperature record for the US since 1880. A rise to 1930, then a decline, then a recovery with no net warming since the 1930s. Here's the rural temperature record from China. Once again, since the mid-20th century, there's been little or no net warming, no spike. And in the Arctic, here's the unadjusted thermometer readings from 8 weather stations. They show a rise to the 1940s, a decline to the 1980s, and then a slight recovery. Little or no net warming since the 1940s, when CO2 began its climb. No spike. There are so many errors and problems with the hockey stick, whole books have been written about it. In 2006, the US Congress ordered a public inquiry into the hockey stick, led by the distinguished statistician Professor Edward Wegman, which concluded that the methods used to create the graph were unsound and the conclusions not supported by the data. Dr. Henrik Tennekes, Director of Research at the Royal Dutch Meteorological Institute, said of the author of the hockey stick, "The behaviour of Michael is a disgrace to the profession."
Spike of doom number 1 bites the dust.
The hockey stick having been so thoroughly discredited, the climate industry was desperately in need of a new alarming graph. Luckily, in 2013, a student at Oregon State University came up with this graph. This was said to depict temperature change over the past 11,000 years. For 4,000 years, temperatures were way up during the Holocene maximum. Then a drop all the way down to the recent Little Ice Age, until finally, you guessed it, a new spike. The spike at the end of this graph was truly spectacular, and again it became a media sensation and a huge hit with climate alarmists. According to the graph, temperature over the past half-century or more had shot up in an unprecedented and alarming way, leaving us hotter than any time in the past 10,000 years, and on a terrifying trajectory upwards. Unfortunately for the alarmists, no sooner had it been published, but our friends McIntyre and McKittrick decided to check out how the graph had been produced. It turned out that, to make this graph, the author used 73 proxy datasets, or approximate measurements of past temperatures from tree rings and such. All of these had been collected by previous researchers. Of the 73 proxies, only 32 of them went up to present times. It is in these 32 that we would expect to find that spectacular spike upwards at the end. I'm now about to show you all 32 datasets, and we're going to play a little game called Spot the Spike at the End. Here are the various records used to produce the Spike of Doom graph. They vary quite a bit. In fact, there's a remarkable amount of variety. But there is one interesting thing that all these 32 studies have in common. None of them, not one of them, has a spike at the end. In fact, there's nothing unusual or striking at the end of any of these graphs. The fact was later confirmed no less in the journal Science, the very place the graph was published in the first place. The proxy data show no dramatic increase in the 20th century. In fact, it was pointed out that the author of the graph itself had demonstrated the lack of any spike in a previous iteration of the graph. The author uses the same datasets and plots similar graphs with no trace of any sharp increase. So where did the shape of this graph come from? First, the process of averaging out numerous conflicting datasets has had the effect of removing real-world natural variation, producing an unrealistic flat picture of historic temperature. Then, onto the end, has been grafted the same corrupted temperature data used in the hockey stick graph. When confronted with this, the authors conceded the 20th century portion of our paleotemperature stack is not statistically robust and cannot be considered representative of global temperature changes. In fact, none of these studies, not one, indicates that current or recent temperatures are the highest in 10,000 years. In fact, if we look at the 32 datasets used in the study, they almost all indicate that temperatures over much of the past 10,000 years have been considerably warmer than today, by as much as 7 degrees Celsius, in direct contradiction to the graph itself.
Spike of doom number 2 on the scrap heap.
Another spike discredited, but the IPCC never gives up. The same year, it came out with this graph of temperatures over the last 2,000 years. Sadly, they only managed to produce an absolutely pathetic spike at the end, barely a blip, and everybody laughed at them.
So they spent 4 years working out how to rework the data and then reissued it with a slightly bigger spike.
Not as good as the old spikes, but not bad. But then the tireless Steve McIntyre set to work again. McIntyre looked into the data and found that the spike had been created by artificially amplifying 20th century warming with what statisticians call a signal-free standardization method. As with the hockey stick algorithm, this statistical trick can conjure up spikes from thin air. Here, for example, is data taken from Asian tree rings using a normal standardized method, no spike. And here is the same data after it was processed by the IPCC's method. One moment, no spike, next moment, spike.
Spike of doom number 3 in the dustbin.
You might have thought the climate alarmists would have given up, but in 2021 this graph appeared, graph number 4. It's supposed to show temperature change over the past 25,000 years. Here's the recovery from the supercold glacial maximum, when the Earth was mostly covered in ice. And here's the Holocene, the last 10,000 years.
Gone is the Holocene climate optimum, previously thought to be the hottest period in 10,000 years. Now the last 10,000 years appears as flat as a pancake, till you get to the last few decades and kapow, a scary spike.
The trouble is, this graph is in fact a simulation of global climate using a climate model. The actual data that was fed into the model, if mapped as a graph, looks like this. There is no spike at the end. In fact, the most recent temperatures depicted here, the data goes up to 1850, are close to being the coldest in the past 10,000 years. In the real-world data on which this graph is based, there is no spike. None.
Spike of doom number 4 down the toilet.
The problem for the IPCC and climate alarmists is that there are now lots of very good studies of the Earth's past climate, published in highly respected journals, which do not have a silly spike at the end. In 2005, the science journal Nature published this. The medieval warm period has returned, so has the Little Ice Age. The recent rise in temperature is shown to have started about 400 years ago, long before human emissions of CO2 started to rise. This looks a lot more like Lamb's original graph. In 2010, yet another study was published in the journal Physical Geography, showing the same pattern. Medieval warm period, Little Ice Age, with temperatures starting to rise about 400 years ago, with no suggestion that human emissions of CO2 have made any difference. How about longer timescales? Thanks to the National Science Foundation and others, we have excellent data for the last 10,000 years, taken from ice cores in Greenland. Based on the data collected, here's a graph showing temperature change in the last 4,000 years, published in the journal Geophysical Research Letters. We see a huge amount of variation over the past 10,000 years. Again, we see the warming from the Little Ice Age, which started 300 to 400 years ago, and we see current temperatures relatively low compared to the last 10,000 years. Here's another study of summer temperatures in Greenland for the last 10,000 years. It's clearly pretty cold right now.
Here's 9,000 years of temperature change in the Makassar Strait, published in the journal Science.
Here's us down here, all sad and cold. Here's a study carried out in the Alps, just published, with Europe warmer than today for most of the last 10,000 years. Between 2017 and 2018 alone, the website No Trick Zone collected 600 temperature record graphs, all of them non-hockey sticks. The truth just keeps piling up.
A study of lake beds recently published in Climates of the Past found that between 8,000 and 3,500 years ago, it was 7 degrees Celsius warmer than today. A study just published in the journal Sedimentology found that sea levels were as much as 3 meters or more higher than today 6,000 years ago. Since oceans expand when they warm up, this shows without any doubt that it was significantly warmer then. And this confirms the results of many other studies of sea levels published in major journals, all showing far higher sea levels than today for thousands of years in the recent past. We now know, and have long known, that it's been much warmer in the recent past, from evidence from tree rings and ice cores, lake bed sediments, and sea levels.
The final nail in the coffin for these silly spikes comes from archaeology. Receding glaciers are allowing archaeologists to dig in areas that have been covered in ice for, well, how long? The receding glaciers have revealed whole Viking farming settlements and Roman artifacts, and remains of plants and trees that grew in northern climes that are today too cold to support them. The Vikings and the Romans were there because it was warmer back then than it is today. There is now absolutely no doubt. Over the past few thousand years, there have been many periods when the world was considerably warmer than it is today.
All of this evidence is quite overwhelming. When they say the science is settled, in a way they're right. The science clearly shows that there is nothing whatsoever unusual about current temperatures. These spikes are clearly nonsense. The climate alarm is a monumental scam.
The story of the climate spikes of doom is a real scandal, a betrayal of science, a shocking example of pseudoscience in the service of ideology, of the corruption of science. State broadcasters like the BBC, who have pushed this nonsense for years, should be abolished. Tax-funded bodies, including NASA and the IPCC, who have gone along with this, should have their funding withdrawn. School books, which use these ridiculous graphs to indoctrinate and scare children, should be withdrawn. There needs to be a reckoning. I'm Martin Durkin, and this is Guerrilla Science.